Thank you all for joining us for what I think is going to be a fascinating discussion. This is a discussion with an extraordinary individual, Ambassador Bill Luers, the ambassador who has written an exceptional book, and of course we say that about the books of all those who come here and speak, but a truly exceptional book because it is both a human story, it is a tale of real people, how they act, how they responded, how he responded at exceptional moments in diplomatic history, in the foreign affairs history of the United States, Europe, and the world, whether in Moscow during an exceptional period in the early 60s, in Venezuela during an equally exceptional period for U.S. policy, in the Department of State, and in a life afterwards that very few of us who are diplomats, former or current, have the opportunity to do. President of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, engaged in the circles of art and culture which have shaped, continue to shape in many ways, America. An exceptional life, exceptionally lived. But there is, of course, an edge to all of this, and that is the discussion, which is quite prominent today in the press in Washington. Hard diplomacy, tough diplomacy, soft diplomacy. What should be funded? What shouldn't be funded? What's appropriate use of taxpayer dollars? What's not? We're not in the late 1950s and the early 1960s anymore, and we understand that. There were exceptional ways of accessing otherwise inaccessible personalities, movements, thinkers in areas denied access to classic diplomatic approaches. But we're still in a world where the U.S. means something. Its values, its culture, and how we best project that, and at what cost, vice other costs. That's a debate. It's a debate that has been bubbling along for quite some time. It has more than bubbled now. It's an erupting volcano. And where it goes is an issue which will affect for years to come, far beyond this administration, the course of how we conduct our business overseas, and maybe more importantly than that, how the United States is viewed from those overseas. I will remind, before we start our discussion, the often misunderstood Ronald Reagan reference to a shining city on a hill. It's often said to be a reference to American exceptionalism. Well, that's not really what the reference is about at all. A shining city on a hill attracts the attention of all of those around it, and thus those occupying that city must be exceedingly careful in what they do and how they do it, because they are looked at constantly. Well, we remain in that sense, maybe more than ever, a brightly shining city on a hill, the object of many, many global eyes. But as I said, this is about Bill and his opportunity to talk tonight. So I'm going to ask some leading questions. But Bill, this is really your evening. But before we go, I want to thank very much the Moody Foundation, Allison Weaver, Moody Center for Arts, for making tonight possible.
Thank you, David.
Bill, thank you. Look, your book is an extraordinary discussion of intersections of history, people, processes. You were able, under extremely difficult circumstances, we'll start with Russia, Soviet Union, to access those, but you did it in a way that was a mix of classic diplomatic contact work and what we might call today cultural diplomacy. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yes. I want to start first with Houston. I have a long, positive relationship with Houston, and I also happen to know Jim Baker. Jim and I and George Bush talked a great deal about foreign policy, including the initiative we took with Iran. We thought we had a way to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and we still think it's possible. Jim was never convinced that was possible, but he always had some very savvy thoughts about the subject. He and George Bush were the two Houstonian officials that I knew best, and they were amazing. George Bush visited us in Caracas when I was ambassador, and he and Barbara stayed with us. And I got to know her very well, but I arrived in Moscow as junior officer, determined to be a sort of George Kennan of my era. And it turned out that the ambassador asked me to accompany Edward Albee and John Steinbeck on their first official visits to Moscow. And I traveled with them both through Moscow and to Leningrad and all over, and got to know them both very well. And they began my life as a figure in the arts and diplomacy. And I found that the arts make life better for a diplomat. I bonded with Edward Albee. I don't know if you've seen any of his plays. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is a play about a couple who believe the lie that they've had a child together. And the husband believes that his wife will not survive if she doesn't continue to believe that particular myth. And at the end of the play, he forces her to face up to the fact that it's a mythology, that they don't have a child together. One of his favorite stories to tell Russians, communism was a mythology which they believed in, and he would talk about the mythologies that the United States believed in. And he almost convinced some Russians that they had a false premise, particularly when one of them told him that the reason Hitler and Stalin had the pact which divided up Poland was that Stalin was looking for a way to delay the inevitable conflict with the Soviet Union. And Edward said, that's a lie. It's a lie just like I write about. And we had a confrontation with the guy. And in fact, in the book I say, it was on a trip from Kiev to Odessa. And he said, I'm going to kill you. And I thought that was the end of cultural relations. The next night, we were in Odessa, and we were walking back from the opera house, where we saw Khovanshchina, which even for Russia is a depressing opera. It ends with the old believers burning themselves up in a fenced-in village. And Edward was telling me on the way back, he didn't like the opera because the soprano was terrible. I was in the process of telling him how the 5 most in-demand violinists in the world were from Odessa. It also is where Ira Gershwin came from. The Gershwins came from Odessa, and many Americans, including Bob Dylan, came from Odessa, the family. And as we got back to the hotel, the head of the hotel was out on the steps with a mob of people greeting me. I thought I must have done something terrible to offend the Russians. It turned out that was the night that we learned that Kennedy was shot in Dallas. We went and listened to the Voice of America reports directly from Dallas. You can imagine what it was like with the Russians so emotional about the death of Kennedy and so moved by the contact they had with us as Americans. It was my introduction, really, because I'd been in Moscow only a few months, and my first experience with Russians was their sympathy and their sadness at Kennedy's death. I told him we've already got another president. Lyndon Johnson was sworn in immediately after the death of Kennedy, and I told him that story, the type of thing that never happened in the Soviet Union. So that's a long way to introduce my first time in Moscow and my relationship with all the Houstonians that I know well.
Bill, what you described, traveling through the Soviet Union, the closed Soviet Union, with some of the greatest writers in post-war America, you can take that forward, and you did, 15, 20 years in terms of the Czechoslovakia at a moment of transition. And what I believe was exceptional entree into a whole collection of not just writers and cultural figures, but the dissidents who were going to establish what became the new post-Soviet republic. Now, did that experience of cultural, artistic outreach, was there a resonance in Washington at that time? Was what you were doing understood, appreciated, supported in D.C. by the department? Or was it regarded as idiosyncratic, something you were doing but not all that important?
What people don't recognize is that Eisenhower, when he became president, having been general, established the United States Information Agency and invited Khrushchev to visit America. And that invitation was dynamic in opening Khrushchev's eyes as he traveled all over his country. And Ike was so smart about this. He started with Khrushchev a cultural exchange program, an educational exchange program, which was very much part of Washington's culture at the time. I don't know when you came in the Foreign Service.
I came in at the end of the 70s, and it was the very end of that legacy.
Well, it was an amazing period, and he had writers and painters, poets, musicians, and it was a period where he was convinced that the United States was leading the world in terms of the arts, and I became convinced partially because of his influence and the influence of the United States Information Agency, which organized itself around the culture of individual countries. When I went as ambassador to Venezuela, I was convinced that the United States had a bias against Hispanic Americans. Very few Americans traveled to Latin America. and I was convinced that there was an anti-Hispanic bias driven by disregard for the role that Hispanic Americans were playing in the United States. And when I went to Venezuela, I learned that the Spanish language is the core cultural focus of Spanish-speaking Americans, and you can't talk about culture without some knowledge of the language. I was very convinced that in Venezuela the cultural programs would work, and I invited virtually every writer and painter we knew. The first visit we had, I invited all the painters who painted our collection of paintings we had borrowed from with the help of the Arts and Embassy. And we had a collection of about 15 first-class painters, including Dick Diebenkorn, who'd visited me in Moscow and who lent me his own Ocean Park series. We had it on our walls for 5 years, and after that it went to Stanford and hung in that museum. We invited all the painters for whom we had this exhibition. One gallery owner whom we knew well lent us to Joan Mitchell, and it was an amazing collection that we showed. For the opening night, we invited the president of the country, plus his cabinet, and everybody came, and here was the press. And there was one writer from El Nacional, which is the lead paper, and he came up to me after the president had spoken, and he said, "Ambassador, I've said a lot of tough things about you, but I want you to know you can say anything you want about the price of oil after that." That was during the Carter administration, when, as you call, the price of oil was very high, and my job was to get down the price of oil, including getting more oil from Venezuela. And he said he would never criticize me, and he didn't. It was a moment that was very impressive.
I have to contrast what you're describing, 60s, 70s, with the experience of diplomats, of ambassadors over the last 25, 30 years, flooded day and night with requests for démarches, for the delivery of instructions, a staff of hundreds in many missions, all of them focused on micro details of quantitative and qualitative analysis of events, endless congressional reporting requirements that have to be met, the interagency, and what you were spared mercifully, what we all were until some point in the mid-90s when this computer thing and internet came into being, cursed be its name, which is you're never able to go from Moscow to Odessa, to Minsk, to travel for days in the country as part of your official responsibilities, whether alone, with your staff, with the kinds of people you had the privilege of taking. You are consumed with Washington. You are Washington. 18, 19, 20 hours a day, midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., on video conferences. The flow of information, the demands are all consuming. And in that world, today's world of all consuming connectivity and demands, the space to do the kinds of things that you and your colleagues were able to do has shrunk to almost nothing. There's still arts and embassies. Every ambassador is able to select from a catalog of artworks or objets d'art what they want for their residents. That still exists. And decades ago, thanks to the Motion Picture Association of America, every ambassador's residence was built with a theater and projection equipment, which was then digitalized to show films, because there was a film circuit, and the MPAA made sure first release films were available for the ambassador to use to do what you did with Cheever and Updike and Albee and Bill Styron. Draw attention to what America was producing, stimulate debate. We did Hamilton in Ankara, but that was a rare exception. It's something that has passed from diplomatic practice because the time doesn't exist. So I'm going to ask you, was this really, in your view, soft diplomacy or hard diplomacy?
It was real diplomacy. I agree with you. I have a problem with the coinage of the phrase soft power because it implies it's somehow not important. It's wimpy. if you're soft, you're wimpy. And Latin America, at the time I was ambassador to Venezuela, you didn't make it to the first class until you sold the Venezuelans some F-15 fighters and sold armaments. During that time, we were tough when we sold and were appeared regularly with the military. And I told the Minister of Defense, please don't ever give me one of your medals. I became so famous by not wanting to get military medals for the work I'd done in Venezuela. I said to my PAO, I only want to be seen in connection with cultural activities. I don't want to be seen in relationship to selling fighter aircraft.
Bill, you were engaged in Washington in the hardest of diplomacy, Operation Condor, and your efforts. I went to high school with Letelier's son, Patricio.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
were you aware what happened?
Yes, very much aware.
Is he still around?
Patricio, I've lost touch decades ago with him. But you might want to talk about that. You stood up on paper, in writing, formally, predicting what you thought was going to happen.
This is not one of the high points of the cultural activity. I do want to tell about Havel, who was certainly the high point of my career. Havel, Wendy and I got to know very well. He was a playwright, and when I arrived in Prague as ambassador, Czechoslovakia was at the low rung of interest in the United States because of the '68 invasion by the Soviets. And so the government of Czechoslovakia had become subdued by the Soviets.
I'm going to interrupt you with a quote from your book. I think you told George Shultz that Prague, which he didn't think you would be interested in, was on the way to Moscow, and he said, no, it's not. It's on its way to Sofia.
For me, he and Larry Eagleburger were making fun of me, and they knew I was desirous of going to Moscow as ambassador. And our friend Tom Pickering was then ambassador, and Tom knew it as well. Tom, who didn't speak Russian, told me he would gladly have given it up to me. I don't believe it, but anyway, there it is. So Havel, Wendy and I got to know him very well, and when I first saw him, I saw that his art was humor, and he was the funniest dissident I knew of any country. And when he was invited to again the opening of our collection of paintings at our residence, he was standing in the study surrounded by Americans, and we had visiting then Cleve Gray and his wife, Francine Duplexis Gray, a writer, and they were close friends. They were both talking to Havel, and I came up to them. I'd not met him before, and I recognized him. I could see that the electricity going back and forth between him and his fellow Czechs was all about humor, about his humor. He wasn't laughing all the time. He was just telling his dry jokes. And Václav was bent over, short, and as you know, I'm rather tall. When he was sworn in, and Wendy and I were invited as personal guests of his to the swearing in, he walked down the aisle to take his oath of office. And I said, oh, he can't really be planning to be president of Czechoslovakia. I mean, it's crazy. This little guy, he was shuffling down the aisle. And I tell you, there was a miraculous thing that happened. He stood up and he took his oath of office. And for me and for all the Czechs watching, he seemed to grow a foot, and his voice was loud. And he suddenly, the first president of free Czechoslovakia. And I just marveled at the transformation of this man over the next couple of years. He became from a funny dissident to an outspoken, courageous president. He transformed Eastern Europe. And in fact, when he came and spoke to the joint session of Congress, and we watched him, he said, I'm asked what I should ask the United States to give to us. And he said, I'm not going to ask for money. I'm going to ask that you give us an important gift, which is to help the Soviet Union get on the path to democracy, which they must follow, because without it, we're all done in. He sounded almost like Zelensky years later when he spoke to the joint session of Congress and was complaining about Putin and the war that Putin was carrying out with Ukraine. And Putin was continuing to do precisely what Havel had warned against when he spoke to the joint session of Congress years earlier. And I hope that history is remembered by more than me, because Havel basically called the dangers that would be coming from Putin and from the United States, which, despite the good work of Jim Baker, of putting Russia on the path of democracy, which Russia never really did, Havel knew would lead to the Putins of this world. When I recognized how clear Havel was as a leader, I said, look, we've got to start a policy with Czechoslovakia. And so we brought all the writers we knew to visit us in Prague. and every one of them met with Howell. And it was really shining a light on him, having them bring attention of the world to Howell's qualities. And they succeeded in doing that. Arthur Miller visited and had dinner with Howell and Wendy and me, and he got the word out that Howell was alive and well, as was the dissident movement in Czechoslovakia.
So, Bill, take us up to today. We have moved to a period more than at any point in the last 100+ years of American history, where international relations are being cast, at least ostensibly, in a pure transactional frame, independent from value, tradition, any other factor than cost, price. What do you get? What do I get? If I get more, I win. If you get more, I lose. What do you think about this?
I don't want to get into a political discussion, but I'd be glad to suggest that I think it's crazy where we are. We should concentrate on the human dimension of international relations and do it through the arts. Kennedy, in a speech he gave on the death of Frost, he said that we know that artists tell the truth. And he said American artists, talking about Frost, should tell the truth, and they always do. And that's why they should be in the forefront of our efforts with the world. And in fact, I came to believe that from my knowledge of so many artists I knew in Latin America, Octavio Paz, Neruda, Carlos Fuentes. They all spoke to me of the truth that maintained their interest in their country. And when we opened a big show on Mexico, and Octavio Paz was our voice of the Mexico exhibition. And he received his Nobel Prize during the opening of that show. And I asked him to give a talk at the Met, which he gave, and it was on truth. So many writers whom I have known have influenced my perhaps naive belief that the arts enable the truth in our dealing with the world. I wish those days were possible.
One last question for you, or comment invited from you. Your book talks about uncommon people, and that's a reference to two things: the extraordinary, uncommon individuals you knew, came to know, worked with, and their role, but is also the importance of dealing with uncommon company.
Like Fidel.
Yes. Want to talk about that?
Yeah.
The uncommon company and the importance of talking to them?
We went and met with Fidel Castro, with Garcia Marquez and Fidel Castro. And Garcia Marquez were close buddies. And Garcia Marquez was a friend of Bill Styron and Arthur Miller. And we went down to Cuba. And I met with Fidel for many hours, including sitting with Arthur. Uncommon company, to say the least. It's not every day you find Fidel Castro wanting to talk to Arthur Miller. And Fidel told me in a private conversation I had for hours as we were driving back to Havana from a trip we'd taken together in the back of his car. I'd asked the Comandante to describe to me the revolutions he'd been involved in, and he described them in great detail. And I said, Comandante, you've carried out many revolutions, and you've committed yourself in the lives of many Cubans in those revolutions. There are many deaths as a result of those revolutions. And as far as I can see, none of these countries are better off as a result of the revolutions. Do you feel any guilt because of that? The human waste it costs you. And he said, I feel no guilt. And I said, how is that? And he said, por la doctrina. And I said, what's the doctrine? And he said, the doctrine is that anytime you have injustice, you have to have a revolution. The subject of injustice was a subject we talked about at some length, but it's people like Arthur Miller who could bring out that type of reaction from a man like Fidel Castro. And how you get to the point where people like Arthur Miller to talk to people like Putin. I believe we should talk to Putin. I don't believe that the guy in the White House now is the one who should do it, but somebody should do it who wants to get to the truth. Because one of the things that I know from years of talking with the Soviets, we always could talk. There was always somebody to talk to in Moscow, and there always should be somebody to talk to. And we have to have that conversation. At some point, Putin will want to talk to us, and we've got to have a way to talk to him. Because when he wants to talk, he will have something to say that will help us get out of this mess. And I think we should take that opportunity when it arrives.
Bill, thank you. Baker Briefing is brought to you by the Baker Institute for Public Policy, which provides meaningful, nonpartisan policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing the United States, Texas, and the world. This episode was produced by Karina Zamel and Victoria Jupp. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Be sure to visit us at bakerinstitute.org to learn more. Thank you for listening.